Hello, Blogging Heads viewers. Welcome to Foreign Entanglements. My name is Rob Farley of the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce at the University of Kentucky. With me today is David Gartenstein-Ross. David, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defensive Democracies, and I teach at Georgetown University.
Awesome. And you've been here a bunch of times, although this might be the first time. No, I think we taught the credibility discussion while you were working at Georgetown. So,
yeah, certainly this is my first appearance of 2015. So happy New Year to all Blogging Heads viewers.
What we're going to talk about today is the big subject is going to be ISIS and all things ISIS. And we will get to sort of some questions about the campaign against ISIS, the state of the military and the political campaign against ISIS later in the dialogue. But I wanted to start out, as you know, and you commented on it, and I commented on it, and it seemed like everybody commented on it. There was a big article in The Atlantic from Graham Wood last week that just created immense waves because it talked a lot about ISIS's theology. It criticized a lot of the rhetoric we use to talk about the Islamic State, especially the politicized rhetoric we see coming out of the U.S. government. And it also had some interesting thoughts on ISIS conception of territoriality. And so I guess I'd like to start by asking what you thought of this big article that everybody's talking about.
I thought it was a fantastic article. I thought it was one of the most important articles that's been written about ISIS. And also a very ill-understood article. What it really points to overall, what the article is critiquing, I think, is our preschool level understanding of Islamic theology and how ISIS fits into the big picture. Part of my dissertation work, I did my dissertation at Catholic University. Part of my dissertation work dealt with how jihadist organizations relate to religious ideas. And there's an interesting body of literature and one work which I think actually does a very good job of articulating the way we tend to relate to religion, as political scientists. And I mention political scientists because I think the same is true within government. It's a book written by R. Scott Appleby called The Ambivalence of the Sacred. The argument that he makes, there's essentially two ways that religion is viewed. One, which is not prominent within U.S. government, is that religion is always viewed as a bad thing. It's always viewed as a source of evil. The other way, he points to, is that religion is always seen as a source of good. And that, I think, articulates the way we tend to discuss this public sphere at a mainstream media level and the way that the government tends to discuss it. That is, anything that's good is from true faith. Anything that's bad is a distortion. So you have Obama. I mean, one of the more amusing moments of the Graham Wood article is when he points out that Obama would technically be an apostate under Islamic law. And he himself is making these takfiri arguments about the Islamic State, arguing that it's not true Islam, they're not actually Muslims, things like that, whereas he doesn't really have the theological credibility to do so. Overall, Wood's argument, of course, is not that the Islamic State represents true Islam. Rather, his argument is that there's multiple things that a religion is. Some things that a religion is are good. Some things that a religion is are bad. For me, as someone who is a practicing Christian, I see both the Crusades and also the Inquisition as not as being kind of the truth of what Christianity should be, but the people who called for them, and most of those who carried them out, or many of those at least, were Christians. There was a religious aspect to this that they believed, and they wouldn't be cast out of the faith for doing so. So similarly with ISIS, Graham Wood's argument, which I think is absolutely correct, is that they take their theological ideas seriously, and we need to as well. And I think that's a very important argument, especially for a lot of what we're going to discuss in a minute about how we're doing against ISIS.
Right. Now, so one of the biggest pushbacks against the article was that it sort of didn't take seriously enough. And I thought, I have never seen as many straw men built and burnt over an article as I have this. But some of the arguments against sort of suggest that it did not take seriously enough the fact that ISIS has come under mainstream condemnation from a variety of different Sunni religious authorities and a variety of different Sunni religious traditions. And so that suggesting even implicitly that ISIS represents some sort of authentic understanding of Islam is incorrect, right? That because Sunni Islamic authorities have said that this is apostate and everything else, that we should understand it in the same sense, and therefore there's some legitimacy to the claim that ISIS is not Islamic, or that ISIS is a perversion of Islam. Yeah. I guess that's part of the argument that I've had the most trouble with or it is an argument I've had a lot of trouble with, but I was wondering sort of what are your thoughts on that particular? Because people reference the big article with it signed by 250 religious scholars to ISIS that says ISIS is bad and wrong and everything.
Yeah. Well, Wood does, in fact, mention multiple times the widespread condemnation of ISIS. I think that there is legitimacy to the argument that you just put forward. I don't think that argument is wrong. And my own way when I would in which I would frame my argument on this matter is a little bit different than Wood's. I mean, Wood gets into the question. I mean, I think that Wood's overarching argument is that ISIS takes their religion seriously. We should take it seriously as well, and I agree with that. In terms of the question of authenticity of religion, that's a much more slippery debate, and so I think that those critiques actually do have a great deal of legitimacy. When I look at this, here's how I look at it. I think that the fact that mainstream Muslims reject ISIS is very, very relevant. And it's relevant in terms of serving as a bulwark. But if you're actually going to diffuse ISIS's theological arguments with respect to people who are being at risk, I think there's one of two things you can do. One thing is make the arguments against Salafi jihadism, but those have to go far beyond mainstream Muslims reject it, because ISIS is very much aware of that. But the second thing, which I think is much more powerful, and this is where our preschool level kind of discourse about religion really harms us, is ISIS, in my view, has committed a number of violations of Sharia law from the Salafi jihadist perspective. It canceled the jizya at Mosul, which you're not supposed to do. I mean, that is contrary to Salafi, even to Salafi jihadi rules of warfare. It's engaged in mass slaughter of Muslims. There's other instances as well in which it seems to have done things like Al-Qaeda clerics came out and condemned it for the killing of both Abdurrahman Kasig and also Alan Henning, arguing that both of them had been operating in Syria under the protection of Islamic groups, and thus to kill them was illegal because they had a covenant of protection. So there's like a number of very interesting areas where, and there's more than just these, where ISIS, in my view, has committed violations of Sharia even from their own understanding. Now, Wood doesn't get into that, and I have a critique of Wood's piece that I put out on Twitter. Kelsey Atherton, the king of Storify, did Storify it, and I'm going to, I think, work on an adaptation for the journal War on the Rocks. But I do think that he gives them actually a little bit too much theological credit, not in terms of the framework, but I think they've undertaken actions that violate Sharia that could get them in trouble with their audience and could put them on the defensive. But in order to get there and make those arguments, we first have to understand the Salafi jihadi case and where it's coming from and what its contours are in order to understand where their actions violate even their own extreme interpretation of Sharia. And so so that's why I think taking their religion, taking their theological ideas seriously matters, because it opens up vulnerabilities that right now we're not exploiting because we stop the conversation with, oh, well, they're widely rich. That's it. Instead, we need to understand where they're coming from so that we can better combat their messaging.
Right. Now, so that is interesting, and I certainly had some of the same impressions when I was reading the article. So I was sort of Wood was overly impressed by the people who were sympathetic to ISIS when they were able to talk sort of in theological detail, right, without sort of being able to plumb that detail from it was sort of, this guy can talk in a lot of theological detail, and so therefore there's something authentic about his theological argument, and you sort of got that, and you can't have every author sort of being a deep expert on Islamic theology and sort of an ability not only to recognize that people are using the language of Islamic theology, but also that they're using that language properly and appropriately.
I mean, I think that Wood is pretty familiar with Islamic theology, and so like my critique would be a little bit different in that. Look, I mean, his argument, of course, is not that they're making arguments, therefore this is authentic Islam and other forms are not. But rather it's that it's an authentic religious tradition. When you think of, this is why I used Christianity as a comparison, which Obama was criticized for, of course. But the reason I use Christianity as a comparison is because I think it's easy to relate. I mean, I've always said that people's IQs tend to drop about 20 points when they discuss religion, and they tend to drop about 40 points when they discuss Islam specifically. So let's at least recover 20 IQ points. And, within Christianity, I think there's many ways Christianity has been understood. When you had the Roman Empire declare itself Christian, you started to get the religion entangled with the state. Well, what is its relationship with the state? Is that a distortion? Theologians over time crafted a number of justifications. St. Augustine, one of the greatest thinkers in the history of Christendom, towards the end of his life ended up reversing himself on one specific issue and came to conclude that it was okay to torture people to take them out of heresy. So, and Augustine is no dummy, and he certainly is not a distorter of Christianity. He's a great Christian philosopher. Now, Christians today rightly disagree with Augustine. I'm glad that they do. I think that he was wrong. But that doesn't make his view an inauthentic one. And so I think that what Wood is articulating, and look, one area I would also criticize Wood's piece, is he doesn't outline this framework and what he means by authenticity. And thus, I think he helped to contribute to the misunderstanding of his piece. For me, as someone who has thought a lot about this issue, he was speaking my language. I understood what he meant when he talked about authenticity and things like that. But I do understand where some of look, a lot of it, I agree with you. There's a lot of straw men that were at play, and you and I talked about that on Twitter. And I agree with you that there have been far more straw men here than for any major piece I've seen previously. But he could have diffused some of that by outlining this framework for understanding religion, which I think is a very complex one, and in part because of something that he outlines in the piece. He talks about how we live in a very post-Christian West. And so this isn't very familiar to people to understand how others can be motivated by religion. And as such, there's a bit of projection.
Well, and especially the audience for his piece sort of lives in this post-Christian space, right? And which we mean the readers of The Atlantic. And I thought Ross Douthat's piece was actually pretty good on sort of his reaction to this article was quite good. I don't normally like his work, but it did seem quite good to me.
Yeah. So anyway, I think that overall, the Wood piece is a very important contribution. I definitely, whether people agree with it or not, I definitely recommend that they read it and read it with an open mind as opposed to read it as a straw man and understand what he's actually saying, because it's a very important piece. And I think it's a little bit sad to me that 15 years into the global war on terror, we're still arguing about whether jihadists take religious ideas seriously.
Right. Well, one of the best lines he had on there was that when someone is talking about this sort of, and I can't remember if this is his phrase or if he borrows it from Haeckel, but that when somebody is talking about Allah while they're beheading somebody, sometimes they mean it, right? Sometimes it actually means something to them, right? That it's not always just for effect. Yeah. With respect to Christianity, and let me float this parallel. I floated it a couple places, and I haven't got a lot of sort of positive reception to it. But there were, my high school, significant contingent of Jehovah's Witnesses in my community. And one of the things that struck me about the article was that there are, despite the obvious differences between the two groups, that the relationship to sort of theological mainstream was sort of an interesting parallel, right? Two different millenarian groups. The Jehovah's Witnesses are very clear about rejection of the Christian tradition past about 100 AD or maybe 200 AD. Very clear that the vast majority of what we understand to be Christians are actually sort of quite wrong about what Christianity means and what Christianity's implications are. And the mainstream has had no trouble in sort of judging Jehovah's Witnesses as being heretics, right? Not always sort of using that language. But to judge them as not Christian would be troubling, right? It would be problematic to sort of paint that label on them.
That's interesting. Look, what I'll say is I don't know enough about the specific kind of ins and outs of Jehovah's Witness theology to know about that. You get into the debate I'm much more familiar with is the debate about Mormons in that regard. Right. And that's also, I think that the mainstream is actually probably kind of split on that issue as to whether Mormons should be considered Christians. Because, among other things, you have a different book in the Book of Mormon, and there's a few aspects of theology that, from a Christian perspective, many kind of Protestants or Catholics find to be disturbing. But there are interesting debates about things like that. One thing I'll point to also, by the way, that falls in line with your argument from the Islamic side, is the mainstream also has no problem, and I think quite rightly, judging the Nation of Islam not actually to be an Islamic group. Mm-hmm. You have two key issues there which contradict mainstream both Sunni and Shia theology. One is the idea that or God came down as a man, W.D. Fard, and then the other one is the idea that there was a prophet after Muhammad, both of which are somewhat core issues, especially to Sunni Muslims. But you get that debate in multiple areas. For the Islamic State, look, I mean, at the end of the day, like I would like the broader Muslim community to declare takfir on them and to declare them not to be Islamic. And I think that's where the first critique you put forward, I think is one that I didn't say was wrong. I think that I would like to see it move in that direction, such that this is kind of a repudiated theology that eventually never comes back. And I think that one reason, actually, I think there's a better chance of that happening for ISIS than for Al Qaeda is that ISIS has just been so over the top evil. As I said on BBC last night, I know the producers appreciated this. They're kind of like, to quote Spinal Tap, they're always turned up to 11 in their brutality, and it's been that way for a long time. And now, they're kidnapping 150 Christians and threatening to kill them all after just having beheaded 21 Christians in Libya. I mean, the degree to which their actions are disgusting and very self-evidently and apparently so is tremendous, such that I think it could eventually lead to really a complete repudiation. And so I know this is a little bit kind of a wordy answer, but that gets back to your very initial point, which is that let's not rule out the possibility that you could see a definitive repudiation of ISIS within the Islamic world.
So the second part of this article, and what leads us to the next, is sort of Wood's discussion of ISIS' conception of territoriality, which has some very interesting military implications, right? That they understand sort of their nature to be deeply tied to the territory that they rule, and that this sets them apart from some of the other jihadist organizations, which have a much more flexible understanding of territory. Or flexible is the wrong word. Okay, we'll stay with flexible because I can't remember the word I'm looking for. A flexible understanding of territoriality. But for ISIS, control of territory is absolutely key to sort of their self-identity and their ability to rule. So first, I guess, is that the same impression that you got? Is that correct in sort of your estimation of ISIS? And second, how does that really sort of open up vulnerabilities? I mean, from my point of view, it seems to open up clear vulnerabilities. Sort of brings them into the wheelhouse of the West in terms of the West's ability to attack and conquer territory in a way that other jihadist groups haven't been vulnerable. But I was curious about your thoughts on this.
Oh, no, I've been making this argument for a while. I think it's absolutely correct. When they declared a caliphate, as Wood says, and I had made this argument. I think I published it for the first time in September of last year, I believe. As I've also argued that their legitimacy depends upon the continued viability of the caliphate. Al Qaeda has controlled territory in multiple places. It's controlled territory in Yemen, in Iraq as AQI, in Somalia, in Mali, and elsewhere. And it's never declared a caliphate, in part because its view is that it would be premature to do so, that the conditions for the caliphate are not satisfied, and that they would end up losing that territory inevitably, which in every case they have. If you have, there's a lot of rumblings about a coming offensive on Mosul, and obviously there's a debate or disagreements that have been leaked to the press between U.S. officials and Iraqi officials as to whether it's going to happen early this year. But at any rate, ISIS's position in Mosul is very much threatened. If they end up losing significant territory in Iraq, such that their holdings are reduced to Raqqa and other Syrian holdings, do they really have a caliphate? And that's a very dangerous thing for ISIS, because what they've done every step of the way is they've opened up new fronts. And this is one thing I would add to their territoriality concept. They've opened up new fronts. They've opened up new enemies. You shouldn't really fight a two-front war. And they're fighting a war on about 7 different fronts and constantly provoking more people to go to war with them. And so as such, they depend upon a steady stream of foreign fighters. This is why their proficiency with social media and their film production, it's not just a luxury, it's actually a necessity, because they need to keep people flowing in, because that's what their business model depends upon. And losing territory could thus actually significantly disrupt their business model.
And I mean, there's some indication that at least in Iraq, and less so in Syria, but at least in Iraq, and you've highlighted some stuff. I know you've written some pieces on this. I know you retweeted a piece just this morning about some of the military difficulties in Iraq. There are some good reasons to believe that military progress is being made and that the ground is being prepared for future military action. Whether it's this much heralded, and maybe we can talk a little bit about, I mean, that sort of takes us a little bit away, but maybe we can talk a little bit about this. We're going to invade Mosul with this many people at this time, on this day. sort of conversations that's been going on social media. But not only is there a potential vulnerability, but there's an actual vulnerability in that their territorial holdings in Iraq seem to be significantly threatened, right? That they are no longer accumulating territory on the one hand, and their supply lines are endangered, their actual holdings are endangered in several parts of Iraq.
Precisely. And that's where, I think there's a few, I think we could have done much, much better in terms of our military strategy overall. But there's a few things that we've done well that are quiet and underappreciated. One of them was bombing ISIS's oil refineries, because there's a big difference between what they get for refined versus unrefined oil on the black market. And there's a lot of evidence that their economy is hurting. They released their projections, their budget projections at the beginning of the year, that they had a $250 million surplus. But it's not like they have an outside auditor coming into Raqqa and looking over their books. The second thing is the coalition strikes have been, and also coalition advances, have been subtly eroding their supply lines. The bad guys need logistics as well. And it's not as though they can't move things from Raqqa to Mosul, but rather they now have to take, they're at a point where they may have to take a much more disadvantageous route around. And that's been a very deliberate thing. It's been slow. Taking like a small town that's close to a supply line, retaking it isn't exactly the kind of thing that makes a front page. But over time, it certainly has had an impact. And, the fact that their supply lines are hurting right now is, I think, very well established.
Right, and it's a tax on their capabilities. So this Mosul question is interesting, right? Because, the hope seems to be, I guess from my perspective on this conversation about when and why and how we should attack Mosul, the hope seems to be that ISIS will actually stand up and fight in defense of Mosul, and that a significant cadre of ISIS will be able to be destroyed in a retaking of Mosul. Right, that you'll be able to isolate and then destroy in what amounts to a stand-up fight in Mosul, and thus significantly reduce ISIS strength. So does ISIS understanding of territorial sort of extend to that level? Right. Is it Stalingrad and they will fight, or is it something where they will feel free, like AQI has in the past, to sort of melt back into the population and sort of retrench in some sense?
They've tended to stand and fight when they really don't have to and where it's a bad idea. They expended more military resources than they should have trying to keep Beiji. They expended way more military resources than they should have trying to conquer Kobani. That being said, to me, the public discussion of we're going to attack Mosul and here's when and here's how, I think that public discussion has been, I would describe it as a bit ill-informed, because I feel that we actually don't have enough information. There's one way that it makes sense, and that is as kind of a psyop, because, and I'll tell you the reasons, but I'm not 100% sure that this is why we're doing it. So I have a little bit trouble evaluating. But if it's a psyop, it basically, you've had some signs of local resistance at Mosul. ISIS is definitely eating its own. It's executed a lot of people, accusing them of treason. In some cases, it certainly seems to actually be correct. They've killed their own provincial governors on more than one occasion. There's been this internal purge within ISIS, which is accentuated by the fact that in December you had a legitimate coup attempt against Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, which caused some high-ranking officials to have to flee who were involved in that coup attempt. All is not well in ISIS land. And so, when I look at it, my inclination, but I don't 100% know, is that announcing this makes a lot of sense, because part of what you're trying to do is to accentuate that cycle of ISIS eating its own. Because, the kind of thing that you could expect in response is when this gets announced, they'd cut cell phone service, as they have on multiple occasions. They'd limit people's ability to travel out of Mosul to try to keep them there, which would in turn generate resentment. They'll try to entrench the city, and in raising security will probably further damage the Mosul economy, which is already terrible, which will in turn make citizens even more angry at ISIS's misrule. So I think that to me, it makes sense if the purpose of announcing all of this is to basically send ISIS into this downward spiral where positive feedbacks keep on accentuating their decline. But also, whether that's a good idea depends on, I think, a little bit of information that that I don't really have access to at my fingertips.
So I guess two questions I have on, well, three questions that this conversation generates. The first one is, could this be as much of a message from the United States to the Iraqi National Army as it is from the United States to ISIS, right? Could this be sort of setting a schedule and then sort of implicitly suggesting that any deviation from the schedule will be the problem of the Iraqis, right? I mean, is that potentially one of the things that's going on here? Which, you know, could also backfire if the INA decides to attack more aggressively than it should at this point.
It's possible. It's hard to know. And I'll say one thing that does cut against my PSYOP hypothesis is the fact that the Iraqis right away rebuked that time frame, which, if you're trying to set up a PSYOP by announcing a campaign, you should make sure that your allies have at least some sense of what you're doing. I don't know. I mean, the thinking, like some of the thinking behind this is a bit opaque. Mm-hmm. And so I'm a little bit hesitant to actually say why we're doing it. Like, I find that as my career has gone on, I've become more and more hesitant often to impugn what the motive is behind a move, because a lot of times as I've learned why things happened in retrospect, there are little details that I didn't know about and basically nobody did, which cause people to get the wrong idea. So sometimes you'll have a personal relationship which ends up swinging events in a big way. And at the time, people are interpreting it as a strategic move, but there's actually a relationship between two people that swung things in a certain direction. And so I find that a lot of analysis actually, especially even when very confidently articulated, ends up being wrong when people don't know the details. And sometimes those details just aren't accessible in public debates.
Right. Internal conversations are different than external analysis, right? And the internal reasons are often given that are much different.
Right.
So my second question has to do with sort of this all is not well in ISIS land. One of the biggest concerns that people have been sort of blabbering on about with respect to ISIS is the returned fighters, right? That people are going and fighting for ISIS and they're returning to Europe, returning to the United States. Sort of my question is, what sort of good reasons, or is there any good analysis that sort of lets us figure out whether someone who has returned from the fight in Syria has returned because they have some sort of radicalized intention to go and do something unfortunate in Europe and the United States, or they're just tired of ISIS and they want to get away from those people, right? I mean, do we have any analytical handle on sort of, because I'm sure these two groups both exist, right?
Yeah.
Do we have any grasp on like how big either group is in terms of people who are leaving ISIS?
Well, let me make one point first, which is relevant to this, because there's a debate about how big a threat foreign fighters are. And when we look at foreign fighters, we tend to look at it through the lens of Europe. You've had about 4,000 Western foreign fighters go to Iraq and Syria, but you've had 4 times that many from the Arab world. You have over 20,000 foreign fighters total. And so when we talk about foreign fighters being involved in acts of violence, like foreign fighters have been massively involved in violence in the Arab world. You've had returnees from Syria who've gone back to Libya and have been a part of the Libyan civil war. The Al-Batar Battalion, which is an ISIS battalion in Libya, for example, has a lot of foreign fighter returnees. Likewise, in Tunisia, you have returnees who've been a part of Katibat Uqba ibn Nafi, which is a subsidiary of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, and has been carrying out a lot of attacks against the Tunisian security forces in the western part of the country. And likewise, in the Sinai Peninsula, you also have returnees who've been active. So it's worth pointing out because I've noticed that discussions almost never talk about those returnees. As to people going back to Europe, look, there's a number of tools that various Western states have to try to determine whether people, are good, candidates for, alternatives to just to arrest or punishment. There clearly are some. There's some who are very clear cases of defection. I mean, you've had guys who have risked their lives to get away from ISIS. But in terms of kind of distinguishing between a possible kind of mole coming back who wants to carry out attacks versus someone who genuinely left them, it's not. I don't think there's a perfect science to it. So what you probably get into as a policy matter is a mix of measures, including analytic tools coupled with protection measures, including surveillance, maybe orders placing limitations on people's travel or placing limitations on their ability to purchase weapons. I think you'll find a mix of policies develops over time in Western states. This is certainly an area where you're going to see a lot of states meeting frequently to discuss best practices.
Right. So my third question, and there was a good War on the Rocks piece recently about post-ISIS Iraq, right? So let's assume that something happens in Mosul, whether it's sort of a Stalingrad in Mosul or whether ISIS disintegrates, but there is going to be this process of the Iraqi government, we hope, recapturing the parts that the ISIS has controlled, right? And what happens then, right? Essentially, sort of, there is concern that the sort of Shia-dominated units in the Iraqi military may undertake sort of widespread retaliation against the populations of the areas that ISIS has controlled, because those areas are perceived as having supported or at least tolerated ISIS to a much greater degree than they should have. What are your thoughts on that issue?
Well, I think that gets to the heart of the issue. It's a real concern. Solving for ISIS or weakening ISIS does not solve Sunni grievances in Iraq. And in fact, Sunni grievances have escalated as you've had Iranian-backed Shia militias play a bigger role in pushing back ISIS, and they've carried out a great deal of atrocities against Sunnis. They've burnt Sunnis alive, just like you had Lieutenant Kasasbeh burnt alive by ISIS, which was such a wrenching thing for us to see. Shia militias have been doing the same thing. So it doesn't solve the problem of Sunni grievances. It doesn't solve the problem of jihadism. And this is also something I've said from the outset, but increasingly, I think that just beating back ISIS is important independent of those. We have to understand that it's not like the end, everything's tied up in a bow and we march into the sunset. I don't think that we should be involved, but in any military way, in this working out of the distribution of power between the Sunnis and Shias. But I think we should be involved in trying to ameliorate Sunni grievances so as to not have a repeat with another even more virulent jihadist group. But even though it doesn't solve those things, to me, like ISIS is just a problem in terms of their religious minorities, their institutionalized sexual slavery, and their attempted genocide of groups like the Yazidis. I think their brutality is so extreme that I think it's throwing everything off kilter. And one of the negative effects that people aren't really talking about, but I think will be apparent, within a year, is the way this has also allowed Al Qaeda to rebrand itself. ISIS is so extreme that the Nusra Front, their Syrian affiliate, is seen by a number of observers as a moderate group. And now the aid being given to Nusra by a number of states in the region isn't as controversial. Likewise, Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi, who is clearly and unequivocally an al-Qaeda strategist / theologian, he was negotiating on behalf of the Jordanian government for Lieutenant Kasasbeh's release before he was burned to death. He was released from prison. So he's been in and out of prison for a while. He appeared on Jordanian television for the first time in a very long time. So I don't think the Jordanian regime is stupid. Mm-hmm. And I think they know what they're doing, and they understand that Al-Qaeda is a problem. But ISIS has been so extreme that Jordan is at least considering ways that Al-Qaeda can serve as a bulwark against ISIS. So the sooner that ISIS is really sent into a tailspin and weakened, I think the better we are, even though that does not at all end this problem.
All right. Well, I think it's been a fantastic conversation. And unless you have anything else to add, I would like to thank our For Entanglements viewers.
It's always great to talk to you, and thank you all for watching.
All right. Thanks a lot.